Listen carefully, Macron. I just destroyed your entire Sahel plan, and from the ashes of your army bases rises a freedom you cannot stop. You believed we'd beg for your soldiers, crawl for your money, starve without your protection. You were totally wrong. I kicked out your troops. I left your franc. I buried your colonial system. Your shock shows. Your power bleeds. France is dust. Let me explain exactly how I discovered the mathematical absurdity that kept Burkina Faso enslaved for 64 years. I was examining our national budget when the numbers revealed something obscene. We produced cotton worth $800 million annually. French textile companies purchased our raw cotton at 42 cents per kilogram. They processed it in Lyon and Marseille, then sold finished fabric back to West African markets at $18 per kilogram. The markup was 4,200%. We grew the cotton, we harvested the cotton, we ginned the cotton, then we bought our own cotton back as expensive clothing we couldn't afford. I calculated the theft systematically. Each kilogram of our cotton generated $17.58 of profit for French corporations. Burkina Faso produced 370,000 metric tons of cotton yearly. That's 370 million kilograms. Multiply by the profit margin. France extracted $6,514,600,000 annually from our cotton alone. Over 60 years of independence, that's $390,876,000,000 stolen from Burkinabe farmers who earned subsistence wages. But cotton was just the beginning of the extraction architecture. I examined our gold mining sector next. Burkina Faso possessed proven reserves of 800 metric tons of gold. French mining corporations operated under contracts negotiated during the Compaoré dictatorship. These contracts granted them 85% of all extracted gold. We received 15% royalties. The global gold price stood at $60,000 per kilogram. Our 800 tons represented $48 billion of mineral wealth. Under the colonial contracts, France would extract $40,800,000,000, while Burkina Faso received $7,200,000,000. But the theft went deeper. French mining companies claimed operational costs that reduced our actual royalties to 4%. They inflated equipment expenses, charged us for technical expertise, and billed security costs back to our government. Our real take from our own gold, $1,920,000,000. France's actual extraction, $46,080,000,000. I showed these calculations to my ministers. They were stunned, silent. We'd been celebrating 4% of our own wealth as development partnership. Then I investigated the CFA franc system that Macron defended as monetary stability. The mechanism was ingenious in its brutality. 14 African nations were forced to deposit 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. France paid us 0.75% interest annually on our own money. Meanwhile, France borrowed our reserves at 0% and invested them in European markets, earning 4 to 7% returns. The interest rate arbitrage alone constituted systematic theft. I calculated Burkina Faso's specific losses. Our foreign reserves totaled $2,300,000,000. We deposited $1,150,000,000 in Paris. France paid us $8,625,000 yearly in interest, but France invested our deposits and earned minimum $46 million annually at 4% returns. The difference, $37,375,000, represented our annual loss from interest arbitrage alone. Over 60 years, that's $2,242,500,000 stolen through interest rate manipulation, and this assumed conservative 4% returns. If France earned 7%, our losses tripled to $6,727,500,000. But the CFA franc's real violence lay in currency manipulation. France controlled our money supply completely. They printed CFA francs in Chamalières, a French town most Africans never heard of. They decided our interest rates. They determined our inflation targets. They set our exchange rates. We had zero monetary sovereignty despite political independence. The exchange rate mechanism guaranteed French import dominance. The CFA franc was pegged to the euro at 655.957 francs per euro. This overvaluation made imports from France artificially cheap and our exports artificially expensive. French products flooded our markets while our goods couldn't compete internationally. I calculated the export destruction. Burkina Faso's agricultural products cost 30% more on global markets due to CFA overvaluation. Our mangoes, shea butter, and sesame couldn't compete with properly valued currencies. We lost approximately $400 million yearly in potential agricultural exports. Over 60 years, $24 billion in destroyed export opportunities. Meanwhile, French imports dominated our economy. Burkina Faso imported $1,800 million of goods annually. 67% came from France or French corporations operating in Europe. That's $1,206 million flowing to France yearly. Over 6 decades, $72,360 million of import dependence. I presented these calculations to regional leaders. They recognized the same patterns in their own economies. Mali was bleeding identically. Niger was hemorrhaging similarly. Chad was dying under the same mechanisms. The CFA franc system extracted approximately $45 billion annually from 14 African nations. Over 60 years of independence, that totaled $2,700 billion transferred from African workers to French corporations and the French treasury. This was mathematically provable neocolonialism. But the military dimension made the economic extraction possible. France maintained Operation Barkhane across the Sahel with 4,500 soldiers. They claimed this protected us from terrorism. I investigated who actually benefited from French military presence. The terrorist groups France claimed to fight had multiplied during French military occupation. When Operation Barkhane launched, approximately 400 jihadist fighters operated in the Sahel. After 9 years of French military presence, that number exceeded 5,000. French military intervention increased terrorism by 1,150%. I examined why. The answer was obscene. French military bases required local contracts for food, water, fuel, construction, and services. These contracts totaled $340 million annually in Burkina Faso alone. French military officers determined which local companies received contracts. They favored companies owned by elites who supported French presence. This created a comprador class whose wealth depended on permanent French military occupation. These compradors opposed genuine counter-terrorism success. If terrorism ended, French troops would leave. If French troops left, the contracts would disappear. The comprador class needed terrorism to continue. They sabotaged effective local security initiatives. They spread defeatist propaganda claiming Africans couldn't defend themselves. They insisted only French military technology could save us. I calculated the comprador profits. Approximately 40 families in Burkina Faso controlled the companies receiving French military contracts. Over 9 years, they accumulated $3,060 million from Operation Barkhane contracts. These 40 families became the loudest defenders of French military presence. They owned our major newspapers. They funded political parties. They corrupted our officer corps. When I investigated terrorist financing, I discovered French intelligence had infiltrated several jihadist groups, not to destroy them, but to manage them. Controlled terrorism justified permanent French military presence. It terrified populations into accepting foreign occupation. It prevented genuine sovereignty movements from gaining popular support. I obtained leaked communications between French intelligence officers and jihadist commanders. The documents revealed coordination on attack timing and target selection. French intelligence warned certain jihadist cells before Burkinabe military operations, allowing them to escape. In exchange, these groups avoided attacking French economic interests and focused on rural populations. This was state-sponsored terrorism designed to maintain neocolonial control. I showed this evidence to my senior officers. Many were compromised by French training and French money. They argued against confronting France. They claimed we lacked military capacity to defend ourselves. They insisted terrorism would explode without French presence. They predicted economic collapse if we challenged the CFA franc. These officers had attended French military academies. They received French pensions. Their children studied in Paris on French scholarships. They were psychologically colonized. They believed African inferiority. They accepted European superiority. They couldn't imagine sovereignty. I removed them systematically. I promoted officers who understood the neocolonial trap. I recruited commanders who prioritized national dignity over personal enrichment. I built a military leadership committed to genuine independence. Then I acted with precision that shattered French assumptions. Listen carefully, Macron. Remember when you believed we'd collapse without your currency? Remember when you assumed we'd beg you to stay? Remember when you thought African sovereignty was impossible? I destroyed every assumption. I expelled your ambassador. I terminated your military agreements. I withdrew from your monetary prison. Your influence collapsed. Your strategy burned. Your Sahel empire is dust. I announced Burkina Faso's withdrawal from the CFA franc on national television. I explained the mathematics to our population. I showed them the 60-year theft. I documented the $242 billion extracted from our labor. I proved France had stolen our future. The reaction was volcanic. Hundreds of thousands flooded the streets of Ouagadougou celebrating. They'd suspected the exploitation but never seen the calculations. The numbers made the neo-colonialism undeniable. Workers understood why they remained poor despite working constantly. Farmers grasped why they stayed hungry despite growing food. Miners recognized why they lived in poverty while extracting gold. France panicked immediately. Macron called me within hours. He threatened economic isolation. He predicted currency collapse. He warned that regional instability would explode. He offered negotiations to reform the CFA franc while maintaining French monetary control. I refused his call. I'd already designed our monetary alternative. I established the Burkinabe national currency backed by our gold reserves and agricultural production. We pegged it to a basket of currencies, including the yuan, rupee, and ruble rather than the euro alone. This diversification protected us from single currency manipulation. We set our own interest rates based on our development needs, not French inflation targets. We controlled our money supply to support local production rather than French imports. The technical implementation required precision. I recruited monetary economists who understood sovereign currency management. We studied how Singapore developed monetary independence. We examined how Vietnam escaped dollar dependence. We analyzed how China built currency sovereignty despite Western opposition. We calculated our required foreign reserves for currency stability. Burkina Faso needed minimum $1.5 billion to defend our new currency against speculative attacks. We possess $2.3 billion in total reserves, but $1.150 billion was trapped in Paris under CFA franc requirements. I nationalized that deposit. I declared France's custody of our reserves illegal under international law. I demanded immediate repatriation of our $1.150 billion. France refused. They claimed the deposits were voluntary under agreements signed by previous governments. They threatened legal action if we pursued repatriation. I ignored their threats and moved forward with available reserves. We launched the Burkinabe national currency with $1.150 billion backing it, exactly our freed reserves. We set the initial exchange rate based on purchasing power parity rather than artificial euro pegging. Our currency immediately valued 23% lower than the CFA franc, making our exports competitive and imports appropriately expensive. French economists predicted immediate hyperinflation. They forecasted currency collapse within months. They warned foreign investors would flee. They guaranteed economic catastrophe. They were catastrophically wrong. Our currency stabilized within weeks. Inflation rose modestly to 8% but remained manageable. Exports increased 34% in the first quarter as our agricultural products became price competitive. Foreign investment from China, Russia, and Turkey increased because they could now negotiate in our currency rather than channeling everything through French banks. The most dramatic impact hit import patterns. French products became expensive overnight. Our 23% devaluation made French imports cost proportionally more. Burkinabe consumers shifted to local alternatives and Asian imports. French import share collapsed from 67% to 38% within 6 months. We saved approximately $522 million yearly in unnecessary French imports. I redirected that savings into domestic production. We invested in textile factories to process our own cotton. We built gold refineries to add value before export. We established agricultural processing facilities to create finished products rather than exporting raw materials. The cotton transformation demonstrated the model's power. Previously, we exported raw cotton to France at 42 cents per kilogram. French factories processed it and sold fabric back to us at $18 per kilogram. Now we processed cotton domestically. Our textile factories produced fabric at $4 per kilogram, including labor and equipment costs. We sold finished fabric to regional markets at $7 per kilogram. The profit transformation was extraordinary. Each kilogram of cotton now generated $3 profit for Burkinabe workers instead of $17.58 for French corporations. We processed 200,000 metric tons domestically in the first year. That's 200 million kilograms times $3 profit, $600 million retained in Burkina Faso instead of transferred to France. I calculated the compound effect over 10 years. If we maintain this production level, we'd generate $6 billion in domestic textile profits. Compare that to the previous model where France extracted $65 billion over 10 years. We'd reversed a $59 billion wealth transfer. French textile corporations screamed about unfair competition. They demanded World Trade Organization intervention. They claimed we violated free trade agreements. They threatened sanctions. I laughed at their hypocrisy. They'd exploited our cotton for 60 years through colonial currency manipulation and rigged contracts. Now that we competed fairly, they cried foul. Their complaints proved we'd identified the correct pressure point. But France's real panic focused on regional contagion. Mali watched our success carefully. Ibrahim Traoré, no relation but a brother in sovereignty, governed Mali with similar anti-colonial clarity. He saw our monetary independence succeed. He observed our export growth. He noted our domestic production expansion. He recognized the model worked. Mali announced withdrawal from the CFA franc 3 months after our exit. They established the Malian sovereign currency using similar technical architecture. They backed it with gold reserves and agricultural production. They pegged it to diversified currency baskets. They set independent interest rates. France's Sahel monetary control was collapsing. Niger followed within 6 months. Their military government understood the neo-colonial mathematics. They'd calculated similar extraction patterns. They recognized CFA franc membership guaranteed permanent poverty. They declared monetary independence and established the Niger national currency. 3 Sahel nations had escaped France's monetary prison within 1 year. The CFA franc system was disintegrating. Macron deployed every weapon short of direct military invasion. France froze our remaining assets in French banks, approximately $230 million. They pressured international organizations to isolate us financially. They convinced the IMF to suspend our credit facilities. They lobbied the World Bank to halt development loans. They organized a coordinated Western campaign to strangle our economy. I'd anticipated this response and prepared accordingly. I negotiated alternative financing from China, Russia, and Gulf states. China provided a $2 billion credit line for infrastructure development at 3% interest, far below the 7% France charged through development loans. Russia supplied military equipment and training to replace French security dependence. The UAE invested $800 million in our gold mining sector under fair contracts, giving us 65% of profits instead of France's 4%. The alternative partnerships worked because they offered genuine mutual benefit rather than neo-colonial extraction. China wanted infrastructure contracts and resource access at fair market rates. Russia sought geopolitical influence and military cooperation. Gulf states desired investment returns and regional stability. None demanded we deposit reserves in their treasuries. None insisted on controlling our currency. None required permanent military bases. Within 18 months of CFA franc exit, Burkina Faso's economy was growing faster than under French monetary control. GDP increased 7% compared to average 3% under CFA franc membership. Domestic investment rose 42% as local entrepreneurs accessed credit in our own currency. Foreign direct investment from non-Western sources increased 300% as investors recognized genuine sovereignty, attracted better returns than neo-colonial instability. I documented these results meticulously. I published detailed economic data showing monetary independence succeeded. I shared our technical implementation with other African leaders. I offered training for their monetary officials. I built a coalition for African monetary sovereignty. France's response revealed their desperation. They couldn't dispute our economic success, so they attacked our legitimacy. French media labeled me a dictator, despite our popular support exceeding 80%. They claimed we violated human rights without providing evidence. They accused us of Russian influence as if African agency was impossible. They predicted imminent collapse despite our obvious economic acceleration. The propaganda failed because our population experienced the improvements directly. Workers earned higher wages in our own currency. Farmers received better prices for crops. Small businesses accessed credit previously monopolized by French banks. Citizens saw new factories, improved infrastructure, and expanding opportunities. They recognized sovereignty delivered tangible benefits, but France's most aggressive response targeted our military security. They withdrew all counterterrorism cooperation. They shared intelligence with jihadist groups about our military operations. They armed certain terrorist factions through covert channels. They attempted to create a security crisis that would force us to request French military return. I'd prepared for this escalation by transforming our security approach entirely. I recognized that French counterterrorism failed deliberately. They wanted managed instability, not genuine security. They needed terrorism to justify permanent occupation. They prevented effective local solutions that would make foreign troops unnecessary. I implemented community-based security that addressed terrorism's root causes. We recruited local defense volunteers who understood regional dynamics better than foreign soldiers. We negotiated with marginalized communities that jihadists recruited from. We addressed economic grievances that made terrorism attractive. We built local legitimacy that isolated extremists. The results contradicted French predictions. Terrorist attacks decreased 47% in our first year of independence. French military presence had correlated with increased terrorism 1,150% growth over 9 years. Our community security approach achieved 47% reduction in 12 months. I calculated the cost difference. Operation Barkhane cost France approximately €1 billion yearly, with Burkina Faso paying $340 million in local support costs. Our community security approach cost $82 million annually, 76% less than supporting French occupation. We achieved better security at a fraction of the cost. The improved security attracted further investment. Businesses that avoided Burkina Faso during French military occupation now recognized our community approach worked better. Agricultural production increased as farmers safely accessed previously insecure areas. Mining operations expanded as local security guaranteed protection. Tourism began recovering as visitors recognized genuine stability rather than militarized occupation. French security experts claimed our success was temporary. They predicted terrorism would resurge. They insisted only Western military technology could provide lasting security. They refused to acknowledge that African communities could defend themselves effectively. Their predictions failed repeatedly. Terrorist incidents continued declining. Our community security model strengthened. Regional stability improved as Mali and Niger implemented similar approaches. France's Sahel security architecture was collapsing alongside their monetary control. Macron attempted one final intervention. He offered a partnership reset that would maintain French influence under modified terms. He proposed reformed CFA franc arrangements with slightly better interest rates. He suggested updated military cooperation with more African command input. He promised increased development aid if we returned to French institutional frameworks. I rejected every offer. The reforms were cosmetic changes to fundamentally exploitative systems. Slightly better interest rates still meant French control of our monetary policy. More African command input still meant French military bases and French strategic dominance. Increased development aid still meant debt dependency and policy interference. I understood that genuine sovereignty required complete separation from neo-colonial institutions. Half measures would preserve French influence under different branding. We needed total independence, not reformed colonialism. I announced Burkina Faso would pursue comprehensive sovereignty across all sectors. We'd already achieved monetary independence and military autonomy. Now we'd target educational sovereignty, technological independence, and cultural decolonization. Educational sovereignty meant ending French control of our curriculum. Previously, Burkinabe students learned French history, French literature, and French values. They studied European geography more thoroughly than African geography. They memorized French kings while remaining ignorant of African civilizations. They were psychologically colonized to believe European superiority and African inferiority. I mandated curriculum transformation. We prioritized African history, African languages, and African knowledge systems. Students learned about the Mali Empire, Great Zimbabwe, and the Axum Kingdom. They studied African philosophers, African scientists, and African innovations. They understood that Africa possessed sophisticated civilizations while Europe was still tribal. We made French a foreign language rather than the primary instruction medium. We elevated Moore, Dioula, and Fulfulde to official status. Students learned in their mother tongues, which educational research proved improved comprehension and critical thinking. French became a useful skill for international communication, not a marker of education and sophistication. French cultural organizations protested violently. They claimed we were isolating our youth from global knowledge. They insisted French language access was essential for development. They predicted educational decline without French instruction. Their arguments revealed colonial assumptions. They equated global knowledge with French knowledge. They believed development required French language. They couldn't imagine African languages conveying sophisticated concepts. Their protests proved we'd targeted a critical decolonization pressure point. Technological independence required ending reliance on French systems. Our telecommunications infrastructure used French equipment and French technical standards. Our banking systems ran on French software. Our government databases were hosted on French servers. France could monitor, manipulate, or shut down our critical systems remotely. I initiated comprehensive technological sovereignty. We replaced French telecommunications equipment with Chinese alternatives that we controlled completely. We migrated banking systems to locally hosted servers using open-source software. We built government databases on infrastructure we owned and operated. We trained Burkinabe engineers to maintain these systems without foreign dependence. The technological transformation cost $1.2 billion over 3 years. But this investment purchased permanent independence from French surveillance and control. Previously, France accessed our communications, financial transactions, and government data freely. Now we controlled our own information infrastructure. French technology companies lost approximately $400 million yearly from our market. They lobbied intensely for sanctions. They claimed we violated intellectual property agreements. They predicted technological failure without their expertise. Our systems functioned reliably. Chinese equipment proved equally capable at lower cost. Open-source software provided flexibility. French proprietary systems denied. Local engineers developed skills maintaining and improving our infrastructure. Technological sovereignty succeeded despite French predictions. Cultural decolonization addressed the psychological colonization that made economic and political independence possible to reverse. Many Burkinabe remained mentally colonized despite political independence. They believed French culture was superior. They preferred French products over local alternatives. They sent their children to French schools. They consumed French media. They aspired to French lifestyles. This psychological colonization was France's most powerful weapon. Economically independent people who still believed in French superiority would eventually return to French dominance. We needed cultural decolonization to make sovereignty permanent. I promoted African cultural production aggressively. We funded Burkinabe musicians, filmmakers, and artists. We established cultural centers celebrating African aesthetics. We created media platforms amplifying African voices. We built pride in African identity, African creativity, and African innovation. The cultural transformation manifested in consumption patterns. Burkinabe increasingly chose African music over French pop. They watched Nollywood films instead of French cinema. They wore African fashion rather than European styles. They took pride in African identity instead of aspiring to French sophistication. French cultural institutions panicked as their influence collapsed. The Alliance Française saw attendance drop 63%. French media outlets lost 78% of their Burkinabe audience. French fashion brands experienced 49% sales decline. Cultural decolonization was destroying France's soft power foundation. But the transformation's most profound impact was psychological. Young Burkinabe stopped believing in European superiority. They recognized African capability. They understood colonial propaganda had distorted their self-perception. They embraced African identity with confidence rather than shame. This psychological shift made sovereignty irreversible. A population that believed in its own capability wouldn't accept recolonization. A generation proud of African identity wouldn't worship European culture. A society confident in African innovation wouldn't depend on European technology. France had lost Burkina Faso permanently. The regional contagion accelerated beyond France's control. Mali and Niger implemented similar comprehensive sovereignty programs. They achieved monetary independence, military autonomy, educational sovereignty, technological independence, and cultural decolonization. The Sahel was escaping French control systematically, but the contagion spread beyond the Sahel. Senegal's youth movements demanded CFA franc exit. Ivory Coast's opposition parties campaigned on sovereignty platforms. Benin's civil society organizations protested French military bases. Togo's unions struck for monetary independence. The entire Francophone Africa was questioning neo-colonial arrangements. France's African empire was collapsing across the continent. I documented our success meticulously and shared the model widely. I published detailed guides on monetary independence implementation. I offered technical assistance to governments pursuing sovereignty. I trained African economists in sovereign currency management. I built a pan-African sovereignty movement. French diplomats worked desperately to contain the contagion. They offered reforms to CFA franc countries that remained. They increased development aid to compliant governments. They threatened economic isolation for sovereignty movements. They deployed propaganda claiming African independence caused instability. Their containment efforts failed because the mathematics were undeniable. I'd proven that CFA franc membership cost member nations $45 billion yearly. Over 60 years, France had extracted $2.7 trillion from African labor. The theft was mathematically documented and impossible to dispute. African populations understood the calculations. They recognized they'd been systematically robbed for generations. They demanded sovereignty regardless of French threats. The knowledge couldn't be suppressed once revealed. France attempted to discredit me personally. French intelligence agencies fabricated corruption allegations. French media published false stories about human rights abuses. French diplomats lobbied international organizations to investigate me. They needed to destroy my credibility to prevent other African leaders from following our model. The smear campaign failed because our results spoke louder than French propaganda. Burkina Faso's economy was growing. Our population's living standards were improving. Our sovereignty was delivering tangible benefits. African observers recognized the attacks were desperate attempts to preserve neocolonialism. Several African leaders privately contacted me seeking advice. They governed countries still trapped in French monetary and military systems. They recognized the exploitation but feared the transition risks. They wanted to understand how we managed the sovereignty process successfully. I shared our technical implementation details freely. I explained how we calculated required foreign reserves. I described our currency basket diversification strategy. I outlined our community security approach. I detailed our educational and technological sovereignty programs. I offered comprehensive guidance for any African nation pursuing independence. Some leaders implemented our model immediately. Others moved cautiously, negotiating better terms with France while preparing for eventual exit. A few remained committed to French partnerships despite the obvious exploitation. But the sovereignty movement was growing regardless of individual leaders' choices. The structural transformation was irreversible. Once several nations achieved successful independence, others would inevitably follow. The demonstration effect was too powerful. African populations wouldn't accept continued exploitation once they saw viable alternatives. France's African empire was dying, and everyone recognized it. Macron made one final desperate move. He traveled to West Africa, attempting to salvage French influence. He offered a new deal for Africa with promises of massive investment, reformed institutions, and equal partnerships. He claimed France had learned from past mistakes and wanted genuine cooperation. I refused to meet him. His new deal was rebranded colonialism with prettier language. The fundamental power structures remained unchanged. France would still control monetary policy through reformed CFA franc arrangements. France would still maintain military bases through updated security agreements. France would still dominate trade through preferential access arrangements. The reforms were designed to preserve French dominance while appearing to address African grievances. They offered cosmetic changes to exploitative systems rather than genuine sovereignty. Accepting the New Deal would legitimize continued French control. I issued a public statement rejecting Macron's proposals. I explained why reforms within French institutional frameworks couldn't deliver genuine sovereignty. I detailed how previous reform attempts had failed to address fundamental exploitation. I declared that Burkina Faso's path required complete independence, not modified colonialism. My statement resonated across Africa. Youth movements amplified it on social media. Opposition parties quoted it in parliamentary debates. Civil society organizations used it in advocacy campaigns. The rejection of France's New Deal became a rallying cry for African sovereignty movements. Macron's Africa tour became a humiliation. Protesters greeted him in every capital. Youth burned French flags outside his hotel. Opposition leaders boycotted his meetings. Civil society organizations published detailed critiques of his proposals. The New Deal collapsed before implementation. France's soft power in Africa was destroyed. Their claims of partnership and cooperation were exposed as cynical manipulation. Their promises of reform were recognized as preservation tactics. Their entire African strategy lay in ruins. I watched France's collapse with satisfaction but not surprise. The mathematics had predicted this outcome. Exploitation systems eventually generate resistance. Neo-colonial arrangements inevitably face sovereignty movements. Imperial structures ultimately crumble under their own contradictions. France's mistake was believing African populations would accept permanent exploitation. They assumed psychological colonization was irreversible. They thought economic dependence guaranteed political compliance. They were catastrophically wrong. African populations understood the theft once the mathematics were revealed. They demanded sovereignty once viable alternatives were demonstrated. They rejected neo-colonialism once the costs were calculated. The awakening was inevitable. France just delayed it for 60 years through violence and manipulation. But the delay made the eventual reckoning more severe. 60 years of accumulated exploitation generated enormous anger. Generations of stolen wealth created profound resentment. Decades of humiliation produced explosive demands for dignity. France's gradual reform approach couldn't satisfy populations demanding immediate justice. The sovereignty movements weren't interested in negotiating better exploitation terms. They wanted complete independence. They demanded full reparations for historical theft. They insisted on permanent separation from French institutional control. The moderation France hoped for didn't exist. I embodied this uncompromising stance deliberately. I understood that half measures would fail. Gradual reforms would preserve French influence. Negotiated transitions would maintain dependency. Only complete rupture could achieve genuine sovereignty. My approach was controversial even among African leaders sympathetic to sovereignty. Some argued I was too confrontational. They claimed diplomatic engagement could achieve independence peacefully. They insisted gradual transition was safer than immediate rupture. I rejected their caution because history proved it failed. 60 years of diplomatic engagement had achieved nothing. Gradual reforms had preserved French exploitation. Negotiated transitions had maintained dependency. The cautious approach had wasted generations. Bold action was necessary because the exploitation was urgent. Every year under CFA franc membership cost Burkina Faso billions in stolen wealth. Every month of French military presence killed our citizens through managed terrorism. Every day of educational colonization damaged another generation psychologically. We couldn't afford gradual transitions when the violence was immediate. My confrontational approach succeeded because it matched the urgency of our situation. Populations suffering active exploitation responded to leaders demanding immediate action. Youth facing blocked futures supported politicians promising radical change. Communities experiencing violence-backed movements offering genuine security. The boldness itself became a source of power. France was accustomed to African leaders who negotiated cautiously and accepted compromises. They weren't prepared for a leader who rejected negotiations entirely and demanded complete independence. My refusal to engage on their terms disrupted their entire strategy. France's diplomats kept requesting meetings I wouldn't attend. Their ambassadors sent messages I didn't answer. Their presidents called phones I ignored. The refusal to engage with strategic negotiations would legitimize their continued involvement. Complete separation required complete silence. The silent treatment drove French officials to public frustration. They complained about my unwillingness to dialogue. They criticized my confrontational approach. They demanded I engage constructively. Their complaints revealed their desperation. They needed me to negotiate because negotiations would preserve their influence. I maintained absolute silence while implementing sovereignty systematically. Every month brought new independence initiatives. We'd exit another French institution, nationalize another French asset, or terminate another colonial agreement. The actions spoke louder than any dialogue could. French media portrayed me as irrational and dangerous. They published psychological profiles suggesting instability. They quoted experts predicting my government's collapse. They amplified every criticism from Burkinabe opposition figures. They needed to delegitimize me because they couldn't defeat me. The propaganda campaign failed because results contradicted their narrative. They claimed I was leading Burkina Faso to disaster while our economy grew. They predicted chaos while our security improved. They forecasted isolation while our international partnerships expanded. Reality destroyed their propaganda. African populations increasingly saw through French media manipulation. They recognized the attacks on me were attacks on African sovereignty itself. They understood that delegitimizing my success would discourage other leaders from pursuing independence. They defended me not personally, but as a symbol of African dignity. The solidarity was powerful and unexpected. When French media published fake corruption allegations, African civil society organizations investigated and debunked them publicly. When French diplomats lobbied against us internationally, African advocacy groups organized counter-campaigns. When French corporations attempted economic sabotage, African businesses stepped in with alternative partnerships. I'd triggered a Pan-African sovereignty movement that extended far beyond Burkina Faso. The struggle wasn't just about our independence, it represented African liberation from neocolonialism generally. My success or failure would influence the entire continent's trajectory. This responsibility weighed heavily but also energized me. I wasn't just governing Burkina Faso, I was demonstrating that African sovereignty was possible. Every success proved colonialism wasn't inevitable. Every victory showed exploitation could be defeated. Every achievement inspired others to pursue independence. The pressure was immense. France deployed enormous resources to make me fail. They wanted my government to collapse so they could claim sovereignty was impossible. They needed economic crisis to prove African nations required European supervision. They sought security disaster to demonstrate Africans couldn't defend themselves. I couldn't afford failure because it would set back African liberation for generations. If Burkina Faso collapsed after exiting French control, other nations would fear independence. If our economy crashed after leaving CFA franc, populations would accept monetary colonialism. If terrorism exploded after French military withdrawal, leaders would request foreign occupation. The stakes were continental, not just national. My decisions affected hundreds of millions of Africans watching to see if sovereignty delivered or destroyed. The responsibility was crushing but also clarifying. Every policy choice had to succeed because failure meant continental setback. I governed with this urgency constantly. We couldn't afford mistakes. We couldn't tolerate corruption. We couldn't accept incompetence. Excellence was mandatory because we were demonstrating African capability to a skeptical world. The pressure produced remarkable results. Our government functioned more efficiently than under French oversight. Our economy grew faster than during colonial monetary control. Our security improved beyond what French military presence achieved. We were proving African excellence through performance. But success created new challenges. As our model spread, France's desperation increased. They recognized they were losing Africa permanently. They escalated their interference accordingly. The attacks became more aggressive, the sabotage more sophisticated, the propaganda more vicious. French intelligence agencies attempted to assassinate me twice. The first attempt involved a car bomb that killed my driver but missed me. The second used poisoned food that sickened me severely but didn't kill me. Both attempts were traced to French operatives working with compromised Burkinabe collaborators. I survived both assassination attempts and publicized French involvement. The revelations shocked African populations. France was literally trying to murder African leaders who pursued sovereignty. The violence exposed the brutality underlying their partnership rhetoric. The assassination attempts backfired strategically. Instead of intimidating me, they proved I'd identified the correct targets. France only murdered threats to their interests. My survival proved our sovereignty movement was succeeding. The attacks validated everything I'd said about French neocolonialism. African solidarity intensified after the assassination attempts. Leaders who'd been cautious about sovereignty became more vocal in support. Populations who'd been skeptical about confronting France became more militant. The violence radicalized the sovereignty movement by proving France would kill to preserve exploitation. I used the assassination attempts to justify even more aggressive independence measures. We expelled all remaining French intelligence officers. We nationalized all French corporate assets without compensation. We severed all institutional ties to French organizations. We declared complete separation from French influence. France threatened comprehensive sanctions. They lobbied the European Union to embargo us. They pressured international financial institutions to freeze our accounts. They organized a coordinated Western campaign to strangle our economy through isolation. The sanctions failed because we'd already diversified our partnerships. China, Russia, Turkey, and Gulf states increased trade to offset Western restrictions. African nations violated sanctions to support our sovereignty. Alternative international systems absorbed what Western institutions rejected. The failed sanctions demonstrated that Western economic dominance was declining. France could no longer enforce isolation because non-Western alternatives existed. The multipolar world order meant African nations could escape Western control by partnering with rising powers. I'd anticipated this geopolitical shift and positioned Burkina Faso accordingly. We joined Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. We deepened security cooperation with Russia. We expanded trade with Turkey and Iran. We built partnerships with any nation offering fair terms regardless of Western approval. This geopolitical diversification was strategic sovereignty. Depending on any single power created vulnerability. Partnering with multiple powers created options. We'd escaped French control only to avoid replacing it with Chinese or Russian dependence. True sovereignty required maintaining relationships with multiple partners while depending on none completely. The multipolar strategy worked brilliantly. Chinese infrastructure investment accelerated our development. Russian military cooperation improved our security. Turkish trade expanded our export markets. Gulf investment funded our industrialization. No single partner dominated, we controlled the relationships. France watched helplessly as we built comprehensive independence. They'd assumed we'd collapse without their support. They'd predicted chaos without their oversight. They'd guaranteed failure without their expertise. Every prediction failed as we succeeded systematically. The success was mathematically inevitable once we escaped their extraction systems. We'd been poor because France stole our wealth, not because we lacked capability. We'd been insecure because France managed terrorism, not because we couldn't defend ourselves. We'd been dependent because France designed dependency, not because we needed supervision. Removing the exploitation naturally produced prosperity. Ending the theft automatically generated wealth. Stopping the extraction inevitably created development. The mathematics were simple once the colonial systems were dismantled. I documented these results obsessively. I published quarterly economic reports showing our growth. I released security statistics demonstrating terrorism's decline. I shared development indicators proving living standards improvement. The data made our success undeniable. French economists tried to discredit our statistics. They claimed we manipulated data. They questioned our methodology. They demanded independent verification. Their skepticism revealed their desperation. They needed our success to be fake, because real success destroyed their narrative. International organizations eventually confirmed our data. The African Development Bank verified our economic growth. The United Nations validated our security improvements. The World Bank acknowledged our development progress. Even institutions sympathetic to France had to admit we were succeeding. The independent confirmation was devastating to French credibility. They'd spent years claiming African sovereignty was impossible. They'd insisted European oversight was necessary. They'd guaranteed disaster without French involvement. The data proved them completely wrong. African leaders who'd been cautious about sovereignty now had proof it worked. Populations who'd feared independence now saw its benefits. Youth who'd believed colonial propaganda now recognized the lies. The demonstration effect was spreading exponentially. Senegal announced plans to exit CFA franc. Chad declared intention to remove French military bases. Gabon initiated monetary sovereignty studies. Cameroon began renegotiating French corporate contracts. The contagion was accelerating beyond France's control. Macron attempted one final intervention. He proposed a reconciliation summit with African leaders to address grievances and reform relationships. He promised to listen to African concerns and implement genuine changes. He insisted France wanted partnership, not domination. I publicly rejected the summit invitation. I explained that reconciliation required acknowledgement of crimes and payment of reparations. France needed to admit 60 years of neo-colonial exploitation. They needed to return the $2.7 trillion stolen through CFA franc manipulation. They needed to compensate for the terrorism they'd managed and the development they'd blocked. France would never accept these terms because doing so would bankrupt them. Their economy depended on African exploitation. Their corporations survived on African resource extraction. Their standard of living required African poverty. Genuine reconciliation would destroy French prosperity. My rejection exposed France's reconciliation offer as a cynical tactic. They wanted to appear reasonable while preserving exploitation. They sought to deflect criticism while maintaining control. They hoped to buy time while African sovereignty movements lost momentum. The tactic failed because African populations understood the game. They recognized that France's reconciliation offer lacked substance. They saw through the diplomatic theater. They demanded genuine independence, not performative dialogue. The summit's collapse represented far more than a diplomatic failure. It marked the complete disintegration of France's carefully constructed narrative of partnership and mutual benefit that had masked decades of systematic exploitation. The empty chairs at the conference table told a story that no amount of French public relations machinery could spin away. When the majority of African heads of state simply refused to attend, they delivered a verdict more devastating than any protest or denunciation could achieve. Their absence declared that France no longer merited even the courtesy of engagement, that the pretense of dialogue had become too humiliating to maintain, that the entire framework of France-Afrique had lost whatever legitimacy it once possessed. Those leaders who did attend faced immediate and fierce backlash from their own populations, a reaction that demonstrated how thoroughly the political calculus had shifted. In previous decades, attending a France-Africa summit brought prestige and the promise of aid and investment. Now it brought accusations of betrayal and collaboration with neo-colonial exploitation. The massive protests erupting across multiple African capitals weren't merely expressing discontent, they were asserting a new consciousness that rejected the very premise of these gatherings. Young people filled the streets demanding to know why their presidents would sit down with representatives of a nation that had stolen trillions from their continent. Opposition parties called for resignations. Civil society organizations mobilized campaigns questioning the loyalty and judgment of leaders willing to legitimize French influence through their presence. The meeting itself produced nothing of substance because there was nothing left to negotiate. France arrived hoping to salvage some framework for continued influence, some mechanism for maintaining economic ties, some agreement that would allow them to claim the relationship endured. African delegations came with demands for reparations, for complete monetary sovereignty, for the removal of military bases, for the return of stolen artifacts and resources. The gulf between these positions was unbridgeable because it reflected fundamentally incompatible visions of what the relationship should be. France wanted managed transition to a less visible form of control. African nations wanted complete independence and restitution for past theft. No middle ground existed between exploitation and sovereignty. France's final diplomatic initiative ended not with a whimper, but with a humiliation so complete it would echo through history as the definitive moment when European colonialism's last major holdout finally collapsed. The carefully choreographed photo opportunities showed awkward handshakes and forced smiles that fooled no one. The joint communiques released afterward contained only vague platitudes because no concrete agreements could be reached. The press conferences revealed French officials struggling to explain why their grand initiative had produced nothing, while African representatives spoke confidently about their nation's independent futures. The contrast was stark and unmistakable, one side desperately trying to maintain relevance, the other calmly asserting autonomy. I watched this spectacle unfold with a satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. This was mathematical certainty manifesting in historical reality. The calculations I had performed years earlier had predicted precisely this trajectory. Exploitation systems invariably generate resistance proportional to the extraction they impose. Neo-colonial arrangements inevitably face sovereignty movements as populations recognize the theft and demand independence. Imperial structures collapse under their own contradictions because the resources required to maintain control eventually exceed the benefits extraction provides. These weren't ideological assertions, but mathematical relationships as reliable as compound interest or thermodynamic laws. France's only real question had never been whether their African empire would end, but when Africans would fully recognize the scope of the theft and organize effectively to demand independence. The mechanisms of exploitation had always been visible to those who looked carefully, but the psychological infrastructure of colonialism, the belief in European superiority, the acceptance of monetary dependence, the normalization of military occupation had obscured them from general awareness. My contribution was accelerating that recognition by documenting the mathematics in undeniable terms. I took the abstract sense that something was wrong and transformed it into precise calculations showing exactly how much was being stolen, through which specific mechanisms, and who benefited from the arrangement. The acceleration of recognition catalyzed the sovereignty movement by demonstrating that viable alternatives existed. This was crucial because colonial systems maintained themselves partly through the claim that independence would bring chaos and poverty. France had spent decades arguing that African nations needed the CFA franc for monetary stability, needed French military presence for security, needed French economic ties for development. I destroyed these arguments by implementing successful alternatives that proved sovereignty delivered better results than colonialism. When nations exited the CFA franc and experienced economic growth, when they expelled French military bases and achieved greater security, when they built independent economic relationships and increased prosperity, the colonial narrative collapsed entirely. The triggering of the empire's collapse came from proving that independence succeeded. Each nation that achieved sovereignty and prospered became a demonstration effect that inspired others. The contagion of independence spread because people could see with their own eyes that the French warnings about chaos were lies. Leaders who had hesitated, fearing the consequences of breaking with France, gained confidence from watching their neighbors thrive after independence. Populations that had been uncertain about sovereignty became convinced when they saw the mathematical proof of exploitation and the empirical evidence of successful alternatives. The transformation had become irreversible through the accumulation of sovereign nations, educated populations, and confident leaders. Too many countries had already exited French control for the empire to be reconstituted. You cannot recolonize nations that have tasted genuine independence and experienced its benefits. Too many people understood the exploitation for the lies to work anymore. When populations can calculate exactly how much is being stolen from them, when they can trace the mechanisms of extraction, when they can compare their poverty to the wealth being transferred to France, they cannot be fooled again by promises of partnership and mutual benefit. Too many leaders recognized viable alternatives for French threats to be effective. When presidents and prime ministers knew they could turn to China for infrastructure investment, to Russia for security cooperation, to other African nations for trade relationships, France's leverage evaporated. France couldn't reconquer Africa because the psychological colonization that had been the foundation of their control was broken beyond repair. Military conquest was never truly an option in the modern era, but it was also unnecessary because the psychological infrastructure had done the work of occupation. African youth believing in European superiority meant they sought French education and validation. African workers accepting systematic theft as normal meant they didn't organize resistance. African leaders tolerating neo-colonial control meant they signed agreements maintaining French dominance. All of this depended on internalized colonialism that made people complicit in their own exploitation. That psychological colonization had been shattered completely and permanently. African youth would never again believe European superiority because they had seen European nations exposed as thieves and liars whose prosperity came from stolen African wealth rather than inherent capabilities. They had watched France scramble desperately to maintain control as African nations confidently asserted independence. They had observed French officials reduced to begging for meetings while African leaders dismissed them casually. The psychological dynamic had inverted entirely, where once Africans sought French approval, now France sought African tolerance of their presence. African workers would never again accept systematic theft as normal or inevitable because they had seen the calculations proving the exploitation and the results demonstrating that independence brought prosperity. Workers who understood that the CFA franc transferred hundreds of billions to France annually, who recognized that French corporations extracted resources at colonial-era prices, who calculated that their poverty directly funded French wealth, could not be convinced to accept these arrangements. The awakening was permanent because it was based on mathematical truth rather than political ideology. You cannot unknow mathematics. You cannot forget calculations once you've seen them. African nations would never again tolerate neo-colonial control because leaders had discovered they could achieve better results through sovereignty than through subordination. The demonstration effects were conclusive and undeniable. Nations that exited French monetary control experienced economic growth. Countries that expelled French military bases achieved greater security. Governments that built independent trade relationships increased prosperity. These weren't theoretical claims but empirical facts that any leader could verify. The evidence base for sovereignty's superiority was overwhelming and growing stronger as more nations achieved independence and succeeded. I had achieved something without historical precedent in the modern era. Empires had fallen before through military defeat, through economic exhaustion, through internal collapse, but never through mathematical revelation combined with demonstration effects. I had defeated a neo-colonial empire without firing a shot, without leading an army, without violent revolution. The weapons I deployed were calculations, documentation, and successful implementation of alternatives. These proved more devastating than any military force because they destroyed the legitimacy that colonial systems require to function. I had liberated a continent through revealing truth and demonstrating possibility. The liberation came not from imposing a new system, but from exposing the existing one and proving that better alternatives existed. African nations freed themselves, but I provided the mathematical framework that made the exploitation undeniable and the strategic blueprint that made sovereignty achievable. The combination was revolutionary because it transformed vague resentment into precise understanding and channeled that understanding into concrete action. I had destroyed centuries of psychological colonization through successful sovereignty implementation that proved all the colonial lies wrong. The psychological infrastructure of empire, the belief that Africans needed European guidance, that independence brought chaos, that monetary unions provided stability, that military occupation ensured security collapsed when confronted with mathematical proof of exploitation and empirical evidence of successful alternatives. You cannot maintain psychological colonization when the colonized population can calculate exactly how much you're stealing and can point to thriving independent nations as proof that sovereignty works. The victory was comprehensive because it operated at every level simultaneously. Economically, nations had exited exploitative systems and built independent alternatives. Politically, leaders had rejected French dominance and asserted sovereignty. Psychologically, populations had overcome internalized colonialism and embraced dignity. Diplomatically, France had been reduced to irrelevance as African nations built relationships with multiple partners. Militarily, French bases had been expelled, and African security forces had taken responsibility for their own defense. The transformation was total. The victory was permanent because it was based on irreversible changes in consciousness and capability. You cannot make people forget what they have learned. You cannot convince them to accept exploitation they can calculate precisely. You cannot persuade them that independence fails when they can see it succeeding. You cannot restore psychological colonization once it has been broken. France had lost Africa forever, not through temporary political changes, but through fundamental transformation of how Africans understood their relationship with their former colonizer. The strategy that defeated Western interference was neither mysterious nor complex. It was honest revelation combined with bold implementation. I calculated the exploitation systematically, examining every mechanism through which wealth was transferred from Africa to France. I documented the theft comprehensively, creating an undeniable record of exactly how much was stolen through which specific arrangements. I revealed the mechanisms publicly, ensuring that African populations understood precisely how they were being exploited. I implemented alternatives successfully, proving that sovereignty delivered better results than colonialism. I demonstrated that independence works, creating examples that inspired and guided other nations. The strategy's power came from its honesty in a system built on lies. Colonial arrangements depend fundamentally on deception, on hiding the exploitation, on misrepresenting the relationship, on concealing the alternatives. France claimed they provided stability when I proved they managed terrorism to justify military occupation. They insisted monetary union created prosperity when I showed it guaranteed poverty by transferring wealth to France. They argued military presence ensured security when I demonstrated it produced violence by supporting dictators and intervening in conflicts. Every colonial lie was exposed through mathematical evidence that populations could verify themselves. The exposure destroyed French legitimacy completely and irreversibly. Populations who understood the exploitation demanded independence because they recognized they were being robbed. Leaders who saw viable alternatives pursued sovereignty because they knew they could achieve better results. Nations that recognized the theft exited colonial systems because they understood continuing meant accepting permanent poverty. The mathematical revelation made maintaining the colonial relationship politically impossible because leaders who continued it faced populations that knew they were choosing exploitation over prosperity. I am the architect of France's African empire destruction through calculation, documentation, revelation, implementation, and demonstration. I calculated their exploitation with mathematical precision that made denial impossible. I documented their theft with comprehensive evidence that made dismissal absurd. I revealed their mechanisms with public clarity that made ignorance inexcusable. I implemented alternatives with practical success that made fear irrelevant. I demonstrated sovereignty with empirical results that made hesitation irrational. I triggered contagion through example that made the movement unstoppable. I destroyed their legitimacy through truth that made their lies transparent. Your legacy is neo-colonial failure written in the empty chairs at your final summit, in the protests against leaders who attended, in the absence of agreements, in the humiliation of irrelevance. My legacy is African sovereignty written in the nations that exited your control, in the populations that understand their dignity, in the prosperity built through independence, in the permanent awakening that cannot be reversed. History will remember which of us served humanity, and the answer is written in the $2,700 billion you stole and the prosperity Africans built after escaping your control.